Hello and welcome to India's World. There are reports that China has placed surface-to-air missile batteries on Woody Island, a link in the disputed Paracel Island chain in the South China Sea. Woody Island is claimed by China, Taiwan and Vietnam. The island has been under Chinese control since 1974. Islands and rock formations in the South China Sea are subject to claims by a number of surrounding countries. China has been extending the coastline of some of these islands artificially, creating new islands and building on top of reefs to strengthen its claim over large parts of this region. While the US, Australia and Taiwan have accused China of militarizing the South China Sea, China has in turn accused the US of being the biggest cause of militarization in the area after a US naval destroyer sailed close to Paracel Island last month. What is also significant is that this region witnesses about $5 trillion of international trade passing through it annually. To discuss the escalating tensions in the South China Sea, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. He's a former foreign secretary, a formidable diplomat. He has also served as India's ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France and Russia. We have with us Ambassador Aftab, Seth, another eminent diplomat. He was India's ambassador to Vietnam, Japan and Greece. And we are lucky to have with us Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, without doubt one of India's foremost experts in China. He's a professor in Chinese studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I welcome you to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. Why is the world worried by what China has done? Do they believe that China's interpretation of maritime rights would restrict the free flow of maritime trade through South China Sea?
Well, you know, China's spectacular economic rise, and whether it will eventually be peaceful or not peaceful, accompanied by a strengthening of its military capabilities, is causing concern. So whatever China does to expand its territorial claims is watched very nervously by not only its immediate neighbors in Southeast Asia, but Australia and the United States, of course. China is determined to, as much as possible, push away American power from the Western Pacific. And this is their game plan. It's, to my mind, a thought-out, long-term game plan of salami tactics, of making claims, backing them up with militarization, and then stopping when the reaction is strong. And then after the atmosphere has become a little calmer and tensions have subsided, to begin the process again. So to my mind, for the moment, it's a winning strategy because the United States has no answer to it.
Okay. Must say, Woody Island already has Chinese military equipment and Chinese military presence. A small garrison has been placed there since 1985. So why the hullabaloo now? Is it being overplayed by the media? And from its point of view, why shouldn't China not try to discourage a US-led coalition from cutting critical lines of communication in the South China Sea? Because they have the same fear.
Well, we have to look at it from the point of view of China's neighbors. I don't think the Vietnamese or the Filipinos are particularly happy with this new assertion of what the Chinese claim is their historical right, their historical sovereignty over these islands. Look at the case of Vietnam. You know, they have a 1,000-year history of dealing with Chinese expansionism, aggression, conquest. Every city in Vietnam has street names of heroes who fought against the Chinese. Chan Hung Dao, where our embassy is located in Hanoi. Li Thung Kiet, Li Tai To, Hai Ba Chung, the two women generals who fought the Chinese. Every single city of Vietnam has street names after these people. So there's a long history of antagonism, of fear. And what the Chinese are doing is to fan these fears. That is what we have to see as the primary cause for the present-day alarm. Okay. Likewise with the Philippines, what they did with the Mischief Reef. The island, Woody Island, they conquered by force in 1974. Mischief Reef, they conquered by force. So it is not as though they have always been there from time immemorial. In our own times, they have conquered this by force. And this naturally creates alarms.
Okay. Professor Kondapalli, when the US Navy talks about freedom of navigation in international waters in relation to South China Sea, what kind of waters is it talking of? Because from whatever little I understand, under the UN law of the seas, there is nothing called international waters. There are internal waters, there are archipelagic waters, there's territorial waters, and there is EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, and then there are the high seas. Now, each of these has its own rules of navigation. What are the international waters here?
Well, in Europe in 16th century, there was a concept called cannon fire rule. A cannon which fires generally at that point of time about 12 kilometers, roughly of that technology during 16th century. So that became international law, that this is the exclusive military sovereign zone for every country, roughly 12 nautical miles. And then the UNCLOS came in the 1980s. They have 200 kilometers, nautical miles of exclusive economic zone where you have economic fisheries and so on and so forth can be exploited, but not in the military aspect. So the problem with the freedom of navigation and the other aspects is that especially in this area, the problem is that China, Vietnam, and Philippines, they have a concept called territorial sea, which means that whatever their claims are, in these islands, there is no way anyone can enter into these zones, military or civilian vessels. That is the problem with the whole issue. Territorial sea means that there is no, without the consent of the concerned country, like China, Taiwan, or Philippines, you cannot enter into the zone. So that is the problem for international commerce. So as you said, the $5 trillion of trade that passing through will have to take consent from China, Vietnam, or Philippines in future if they garrison the whole area. That's the problem.
But quickly, sir, but this is EEZ area. This Paracel Island is EEZ area disputed, but it's EEZ.
No, to put it simply, international waters simply means that it is not under the sovereignty of any coastal state. And the international community shipping, otherwise they have the right.
This is not a
of free
definition
passage.
under UNCLOS.
No, this is what it means. Where you call it, point is, I think it's been explained by Professor Kondapalli well as to what are the kind of rights you can exercise it under UNCLOS. Now, actually it pertains to the exercise of sovereignty by preventing other, especially naval vessels, to cross this, and also to obtain the permission of the coastal state for passage. This is what the United States is
due
not
regards
accepting.
should be given to the rights of others to navigate, but due regards has not been defined, and perhaps the Chinese are taking advantage
I think the
of
issue
that.
is very clear. This is just semantics. Because, the Chinese have this 9-dash line. If it was to be accepted, then the South China Sea mostly becomes a Chinese lake. There is no ground on the basis of which, whether historically or under UNCLOS or any other basis, can China claim this 9-dash line. I mean, we can say, look, it's in the Indian Ocean, it's Indian Ocean, so the whole of Indian Ocean belongs to us. I mean, this will be an absurd argument. This is the problem. Now China is trying to, by reclaiming islands, by garrisoning islands, putting military facilities there, is actually in effect in the process of exercising sovereignty and compelling other countries to accept their sovereignty and then seek their permission for any kind of activity. And this is what is being resisted.
All right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this discussion in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing escalating tensions in South China Sea. Ambassador Aftab Seth, who really is militarizing South China Sea, considering that while the US accuses China of militarizing it, the US has also been sailing naval vessels, destroyers in this area?
Yes, they have, and no one has really protested about those sailings except the Chinese. The Vietnamese and the Filipinos are quite happy, even though these sailings are close to islands that they claim. But they are not unhappy that the United States is showing the flag in what everyone else recognizes as international waters. So what Ambassador Sibal said about salami tactics is relevant, because I remember way back in '98, the Chinese were using the same tactics as they used 2 years ago, sending tourists, Chinese tourists, to islands which are under dispute, sending oil rigs to islands which are in dispute to exercise what they claim is their right of sovereignty. You recall in recent, just 2 years ago, a $1 billion huge rig was sent into waters which the Vietnamese claim as clearly their own, and this led to a great furor in Vietnam and riots against the Chinese, in which, by mistake, a few Taiwanese.
I'm not denying all
factories-
that. I'm not denying all that. I'm trying to understand, for example, and let me take this question to Professor Kondapalli. What does militarization of a region really mean? If it means adapting that region for military purposes, then other claimants in the South China Sea, especially Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines and Vietnam, militarized some of these islands years ago. They built airstrips there, they built harbors there where military vessels can come, where airstrips where military aircrafts can land and do land. So what is so special only about China militarizing it, and how is the militarization by others all right?
Statistically speaking, you're right that the other countries have started encroaching on the South China Sea islands. Vietnam, for instance, had the maximum number of islands occupation in the South China Sea. Second is Filipinos. But the issue is that they have not militarized these substantially as China had done. China had very few islands before, but it started militarizing, meaning putting weapon systems. For example, the series of Woody Island has been expanded. The runway has been expanded to about 2,000 meters, which can accommodate basically fighter aircraft and even transport aircraft on these islands. Again, they have the destroyers and frigates placed in these places. Then they have also the signals intelligence facilities and other.
So it's more intensive militarization.
Indeed.
And extensive.
So that is what the concern here is.
All right.
Statistically speaking, yes, indeed, the Vietnamese and Filipinos occupied more. But these islands, we should understand that these islands are just about 1 meter high above the sea level. So most of these get submerged.
Some of them are
if you have
disputed
a
also,
high
whether
tide.
they're rock formations or whether they're islands. But let me, on this issue of militarization, Mr. Sibal, why don't we talk of the larger region where militarization is taking place? After all, what is US rebalancing in this region all about? It's about increasing their military presence. So US access to military bases in Thailand, in Philippines, and now to airports in Malaysia and Singapore for their Poseidon anti-submarine hunters, electronic warfare platforms. Why is that not considered militarization? Why is South China Sea not seen in this larger context of militarization?
No, I think you have to look at it historically. One, of course, United States is present so strongly in this region as a result of the Second World War. And it has treaty relations with so many other countries. And it has responsibility for the defense of Taiwan. So it's a historical fact, and it's all legal, where partner countries have exercised their sovereign right to establish a treaty relationship with the United States, under which the United States has assumed certain military responsibilities, and it can discharge them only if it has these bases and forward formations to protect the interests of these countries. What China is now doing with this increasing economic and military muscle is to push back the United States. That's where the problem is. So China is not doing this either in partnership or with the consent of any of its neighbors. On the contrary, it's challenging all of them. And it's asserting historical claims which have no basis in history except that the Chinese believe that they have a right. So that's where the problem is. So I would say that China, for whatever reasons, is acting in the present context offensively in order to change the status quo on the ground, and that's what's leading to tensions.
Okay. Abbas, just on what China is doing. Now, China doesn't deny that it's built airstrips or it's built ports that can accommodate military aircraft. What it says is that their main use will be for humanitarian purposes, which means search and rescue and disaster response. Now, should one buy this argument or should one reject it and say, look, you are doing it for some other reasons and building these things under false pretexts?
No, I think, its status quo powers historically have always looked slightly askance at the new rising power. Remember, in the 20s, and when Japan was building its navy, America and Britain looked upon that with a certain degree of trepidation and fear, and they made various efforts to try and curb the Japanese. Likewise, after the First World War, when the Germans started to rebuild their navy, there was an attempt to curb. So this is an inevitable aspect of history. Status quo powers will always try and see that their power structure remains intact, and the new power which is trying to assert itself is kept under check.
Okay, do you agree with it quickly?
Well, I think what the Chinese have done is shift the goalposts. In 2002, they had the Declaration of Conduct, which is not exactly binding on any parties to the dispute. Then they introduced the peaceful rise, peace and development. That doesn't gel with the military kind of installations that have been put up. So I think China is buying time in this period. Also, what struck me was when President Xi Jinping went to the United States, he gave a statement saying that we have no intention to militarize the South China Sea.
Spratly Islands was what he meant. That's what has been clarified since
That's true. So the current HQ-9 has been placed in Woody Island, part of the Paracels.
That's the surface to air missile.
Technically, that's right. Technically, he's right. But militarization, for instance, on the Subi Reef, Johnson Reef, Mobini Reef, all the 5 reefs that China had constructed, there are satellite images of these military installations coming up.
Okay.
So not just in the Paracels, but also in the South China Sea, we see the militarization happening.
Okay.
Dual-use facilities which can be used for military purposes.
All right.
So goalposts have been shifted.
Okay. All right. We need to take a break again. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing militarization of South China Sea. Master Sibal, you wanted to say something?
In response to what you said about they're giving the reason for all this militarization that is for humanitarian purposes, etc., etc. I think they are making a mockery of the intelligence of others. And this actually raises serious doubts about the manner in which China understands how the others are reacting to its policies. That is one. Number two, in the case of Philippines, the Philippines took them to the International Court of, and they have refused to accept the jurisdiction of the International Court. Now, if they are really wanting to resolve this on a peaceful basis, they should accept and let the International Court decide on the legality of Philippines' claims or their claims. Number three, that, by putting up lighthouses, as they say, they will guide ships and stuff like that. This is a way of asserting sovereignty. So they are skirting the entire issue by these kind of, to my mind, silly arguments.
Okay. Seth, why hasn't the US been able to persuade ASEAN countries to push back against China? There was a meeting in California recently. President Barack Obama met the ASEAN leaders. And why are ASEAN countries who are non-claimants in South China Sea, such as Laos and Cambodia, not coming on board?
Well, Laos and Cambodia, for obvious reasons, are not going to be very vociferous.
Because of trade links.
Trade links, and they are small and not powerful countries. But the countries like Vietnam and the Philippines are
But
being
they're all
assertive.
claimant countries.
And they're claimant countries and they're being assertive. But the point really is about whether you can take what the Chinese say at face value. Do you remember when Xi Jinping was here, President Xi Jinping was here, September the 17th. Our president had just been to Vietnam and back. And while he was on our soil, their troops were floating around in Ladakh and occupying territory which is clearly ours. While Abe was making preparations to meet Xi Jinping in Beijing during the APEC summit in November 2014, I'm talking about the same year, Chinese fishing boats were off the Ogasawara Islands of Tokyo, stealing Japanese red coral. So there's the right hand, left hand business.
Okay.
Xi Jinping making assertions of friendship in Delhi, his troops, and he's the man in charge of the Chinese military, are entering our territory. Abe is trying to make an effort at a rapprochement with Xi Jinping in Beijing, and his fishing boats are stealing Japanese coral.
Or
So
when
this
Abe
is,
goes to Sri Lanka, the Chinese send their submarine to Sri Lanka.
that's right.
But if ASEAN countries are not being persuaded, not all of them, because probably these themselves see themselves as a trading bloc, an economic bloc, and not as a security bloc. If they're not being persuaded by the US to push back against China, why is India discussing joint patrolling of South China Sea with America?
As far as the ASEAN is concerned, it's a divided house. Although the Chinese have had trilateral cooperation with Vietnam and Philippines on the fisheries, and also Malaysia joined the negotiations for the South China Sea aspects. Hanoi meeting in 2010 was very explicit on the freedom of navigation issues and the sovereignty issues to be resolved through peaceful means, etc. Secondly, Phnom Penh meeting was the first meeting in ASEAN history which had not resulted in a joint statement. And speculation was that China was putting a lot of pressure on Laos and Cambodia.
But about India, my question really was about India.
The second part on India, I think India has vital interests in this region. Number one, of course, India can also say that from Chola Empire onwards, the whole area was under the Indian control. So India has claims over these regions. But rationally, India had not done that kind of historical claim on that region. However, I think currently India has 55% of its trade passing through the South China Sea. So it's vital for us that we involve in the freedom of navigation. As Raksha Mantri Anthony said before, we have no sovereignty disputes. The disputes have to be resolved peacefully in a bilateral fashion. But we support the freedom of navigation because our trade is passing through. Okay. And it's vital for us.
Okay, you wanted to say something.
Yes, but I think it would. I don't know why the Americans have, leaked to the press that this was discussed, joint patrolling in the Indian Ocean and possibly in South China Sea. Now, it's possible that the Americans raised this. One doesn't know what our response was, but this was a mischievous leak on their part. There's absolutely no reason.
Forget the leak. Should we be doing it?
No, there's absolutely no reason why India should get involved in joint patrols, which means joint policing in the South China Sea. Let's first take care of the Indian Ocean. Let's first the United States satisfy us on what they're doing with Gwadar, with Chinese increased presence in the Indian Ocean. If at all, if you have to do some joint patrolling, let's do it in the Indian Ocean, and then we'll see what we'll do in South China.
What do you have to say? Considering that we have signed a joint vision statement for the Pacific and for Indian Ocean with America.
Well, no joint patrols, but as Professor said, we have a very vital stake there. Apart from 55% of our trade, don't forget that from the 80s, the Oil and Natural Gas Commission of India has been deeply involved in exploration of oil and gas in the seas of Vietnam. And on September the 17th, 2011, in order to frighten us away, the Chinese actually cut a cable of a Vietnamese oil drilling ship. Pallam Raju and S.M. Krishna, who was our foreign minister, Pallam Raju, our Minister of Defense, Minister of State for Defense, both traveled to Hanoi to tell the Vietnamese that we are not frightened, we will remain here, we are here to stay from the 80s, and we have been given new blocks. We are here to jointly, for our mutual benefit, exploit oil and natural gas so that we can satisfy our energy needs. So it is vital that no outside power interferes with our freedom of navigation, our freedom of activity, which is in our interests.
But yet you're saying no joint patrolling.
Joint patrolling, I think, is a bit excessive, especially in the seas outside our immediate territory.
We can have military exercise with Vietnam. There's no problem.
Yeah, with Vietnam,
Now,
it's
there are
fine.
two people who are saying that we should have no joint patrolling. You're the only one who's saying we should. Are you modifying your views now in view of what these people have said, or are you still sticking to it?
Well, all the parties are suggesting to no territorial sea concept, but freedom of navigation. On that, there is a certain commonality between all the parties. But I would suggest that India should take the initiative with Vietnam. As Ambassador Seth mentioned, we have pumped in $5 billion of Indian taxpayers' money in the 128, 129 blocks in Vietnam-controlled areas in in South China Sea.
Naval exercise with Vietnam is
SR
what you're
company, which
recommending.
is a private company, also had invested in this area. So two Indian majors,
No, I'm
oil
agreeing with
majors.
you there. I'm merely asking you, are you asking for joint exercise with Vietnam, or are you saying we should do joint patrolling with the US?
I think we should do with all, including with China. I would suggest we should do joint patrolling even with the Chinese.
What
We have,
purpose
done,
does
we
that
have done joint patrolling with the Americans and the Japanese off Okinawa as far back as April 2007.
There's a difference between joint exercises and joint patrolling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, we must not blur that distinction.
All right, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank all my guests, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Ambassador Aftab Seth, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.